Good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of SUNY Plattsburgh, the Institute for the Study of Canada, and the Centre for the Study of Canada, welcome to today's event, which, as you know, is the Distinguished Fulbright Chair in Quebec Studies Lecture. We're very delighted, and we'll be soon introducing my colleague Jean-François Godbout, who will be speaking to us about a very relevant, timely topic. We are grateful that you've taken time out of your day to be here. We anticipate you'll enjoy the conversation that we're about to have, and hopefully in this wonderful academic setting we'll all learn a whole bunch of new things. Having said that, and before I go any further, it's my pleasure to introduce the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Provost, Dr. Anne Herzog. Anne, please.
Thank you, Chris. And welcome, everyone. I'm really pleased to see so many of our students here, some of my colleagues. Welcome also to members of our larger community, our larger Plattsburgh community. The Distinguished Fulbright Lecture is delivered by the holder of the Distinguished Fulbright Chair in Quebec Studies, a position created at SUNY Plattsburgh in 2011, thanks to an ongoing agreement between SUNY Plattsburgh, Fulbright Canada, and the Quebec government's Ministry of International Relations and La Francophonie. A new agreement was signed last week to ensure the Distinguished Fulbright Chair in Quebec Studies continues through the 2023-2024 academic year. Fulbright Canada Research Chairs are for Canadian citizens who are exceptional scholars who wish to conduct research and lecture in the United States on subjects that are important to the university that hosts the chair position. Prestigious universities across the United States have similar research chairs, such as Yale University, Dartmouth College, and Johns Hopkins, to name a few. 8 previous scholars from universities located in Quebec have come to SUNY Plattsburgh to serve in the position of Distinguished Fulbright Chair in Quebec Studies. It is exciting to support SUNY Plattsburgh's Distinguished Fulbright Chair in Quebec Studies initiative, as it is the only such chair specifically dedicated to Quebec Studies in the United States. And it's my pleasure now to ask Dr. Christopher Kirky, Director of the Centre for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at SUNY Plattsburgh, to say a few words and to introduce our keynote speaker. Chris.
Thank you, Anne. I will just mention a few quick things. Maybe I'll move that up and get a little less feedback for everybody. Anne was kind enough to mention that we started this program in 2011, and our Institute on Quebec Studies go back to 2005. A few years after we had begun to operate our center and do a variety of program initiatives, one of the things that we thought would be extremely valuable for the purposes of our audience here on the campus and in our community would be to avail of ourselves, if you would, of having a really top-notch scholar who would come down every single year, spend a semester with us, working on a fabulous, timely, and important research project. And we've been fortunate in that regard to have this partnership between Fulbright Canada, the Government of Quebec, and our institute at SUNY Plattsburgh. So each and every year we've had, with the exception of last year because of the pandemic, we've had a top flight individual from a variety of disciplines, both in the humanities and social sciences, who come down just down the street over at 133 Court Street and work on something. And what's been perhaps most compelling about this arrangement is that it's not been sort of a, to use vernacular, it's not been a one and done, which is to say we've had a lot of people who've come down here and spent a semester with us, and we've built on that relationship in many, many ways. For example, our institute is currently working on 3 book projects that are in part or in whole a result of having hosted someone from the University of Montreal, the École Nationale d'Administration Publique, the University of Quebec at Montreal, McGill, and so on. So we've had some really wonderful opportunities. That was, how would you say, an unanticipated long-term benefit. Sometimes those sort of connections, those sorts of arrangements transpire, and sometimes they don't. But I'm happy to say in our case they have. And I have a sense that with Jean-François being here, that's only going to continue into the future. Allow me a moment. I know you have your program in front of you, so I won't simply read what you have. But let me tell you, Jean-François' program that he submitted as a research project, which is outlined in your second paragraph on the inside cover of your program today, was one of the most compelling projects that the peer review committee, composed of a seasoned group of academics from Canada, looked at and resulted in his recommendation to us. It was novel, it was important, it was cross-disciplinary, and we're delighted that he's able to work on that while he's with us. When we spoke earlier about what the focus of his remarks would be today, he said, Chris, you know, I think with the provincial election coming up in Quebec, and given Plattsburgh's proximity to Quebec, I think the audience don't necessarily want to go back a couple of 100 years or 100 years, but I think they want to look forward, you know, and sort of what does this mean? And for a community that has such close and deep ties to Quebec. So today, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Jean-François Godbout from the University of Montreal, who will speak on stability and change in the 2022 Quebec election. And he'll be pleased to take questions afterwards. Jean-François, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris, and thanks to the provost and Herzog for introducing me. And I also want to thank Professor Matthew Smith to allow me to take his students away from his class today and to talk about my research on Quebec politics. I'm very honored to be here in Plattsburgh today. I want to begin by acknowledging the financial support provided by the Center for the Study of Canada at SUNY Plattsburgh and the Institute of Quebec Studies, as well as Fulbright Canada. This wouldn't have been possible without their help. Thanks also to the members of the staff, especially Lisa Bedar and Amy Sutherland for organizing all of this today. You know, I really appreciate being in Plattsburgh. The town is wonderful. People have been really welcoming. The university has been super welcoming and accommodating for me. And it's really been a terrific research lead so far. So thank you very much for that. And I especially want to thank you for being here, the students, but also the members of the public and the faculty. It's special for me to be here today, not only because it's a lecture about my work and the Fulbright collaboration, but also it's my first occasion to talk in public since the beginning of this pandemic in 2010, without a mask and with people in the room. I'm so glad I don't have to do this on Zoom. You don't know how much. I know it might be more fun for you guys to be on Zoom, but believe me, it's nice to see faces, and I'm glad for that. So finally, I want to acknowledge the contribution of my colleague, Éric Bélanger, a professor at the University of McGill, who's been collaborating with me on some aspects of this presentation today. It's a joint project, but today I'm speaking on my own terms. All errors, mistakes are my own, and so I'm taking this in my direction, but bear in mind, I also got help from Éric Bélanger, a great friend and colleague, especially with the data that I'm using in this analysis. So let me begin with sort of a question. What's going on in Quebec politics today? If you're following Quebec's politics, you know that there's an election coming up in October of 2022, and you also know that the party system seems to be in a complete shamble. It's in a complete mess. So in today's presentation, I will explain why this is important for not only for Canadian politics, but also, perhaps surprisingly, for American politics. Not only for you guys in New York State or at SUNY Plattsburgh, but also for Americans in general, of things to come in the future. So let me begin by stating a couple of facts, okay? I'm going to put my professor hat here and just outline a few things. So you all know that Quebec is a province of Canada, right? But jokes aside, like Canada, Quebec, and the United Kingdom, they all share a common parliamentary system, which we call a Westminster-style parliamentary system, where elections are determined, people are elected to Parliament, based on the first past the post electoral system, just like in in the United States, right? When you go and vote for your legislator in the state assembly or in Congress, whoever has the plurality doesn't need to be the majority. Whoever finishes first in the vote, unless there's a runoff in Georgia, that's a separate case, but most of the time, whoever gets the most vote wins the seat, right? And political scientists have been studying since the 1940s and even before the effects of the voting system on the structure, the number of parties competing, and the issues dividing the parties and whatnot. And what we know from a French political scientist called Maurice Duverger, who published a book in 1949, he noted that in countries where you have a first-past-the-post electoral system, because of the way of the plurality system, you tend to see a convergence towards two parties in the party system, two main parties opposing each other. Because of plurality, if you vote for 5 parties, it's wasted vote. Whoever gets the most vote wins the seat. So people tend to kind of organize around two parties. And that became one of the few laws we have in social science called Duverger's law, right? So what's puzzling in Quebec is that right now, in the current parliament, right, in 2022, that followed the, I'm gonna move this around. Can you guys hear me? All right, I'm gonna talk a little louder. Sorry, it's just the echo is a little bothersome. So in Quebec's parliament right now, in the state assembly, we have 4 parties elected with members, right? So in the US, it would be there's a Republican Party, Democratic Party, Green Party, Progressive Party. 4 parties in parliament. And now there's even a 5th party that's polling around 10, some say even 20% of the, in public opinion polls. People are saying perhaps this party is going to get as much as 20% of the vote. So it's really mind-boggling if you go back to this Duverger's law, like why is there 5 parties now competing when there should be only 2, right? Because what goes on in a parliamentary system, when you divide the votes among several different parties in an election, you risk getting a minority government. And I spoke to Matthew earlier, and he told me that you guys saw what a minority government was in parliament at the federal level, but the same thing can happen at the provincial level. The last one was in 2014. I have it here. It's the PQ minority government. See, they won 31% of the vote, only 54 seats out of 125, and they were the government then. But so this is just to give you an history. 4 parties, Parti libéral du Québec, the Liberal Party in red, which is kind of the party that has been governing the most since 2000. Then you have the Coalition Avenir Québec, the CAQ, in light blue, which is currently the party in government. Then you have the Parti québécois in dark blue, which has had a lot of government in the 70s and 80s and in the 90s, but not so much since 2000. The only time they were in power as a minority government. And you have the new party, the new kid on the block, if you will, the Quebec party called Québec Solidaire in orange, which is a Labour party, but I'll be talking a little more about this party in a little bit. Okay, so these are the names of the parties. Forget the notes there if you're interested, you know what I'm talking about, but it gives you an idea of what happens. You split the vote, 24, 37, 17, 16, and note that with 37% of the popular vote, the CAQ won 74 out of 125 seats, right? So close to 60% of the seats. So that's because of the vote splitting I was telling you. That explains Duverger's law. You don't like wasting your vote like that. Eventually, there's a convergence towards 2 parties, but it doesn't seem to be the case in Quebec, right? So these are the leaders of the parties currently that are going to go up for election. You have the Prime Minister here, François Legault, Madame Dominique Anglade, which is the leader of the Liberal Party. You have Éric Duhem, which is the new kid on the block, the new party I was telling you about, that's kind of polling high. He shouldn't be there, but he's there, right? So that's the 5th party. That's the Labour Party I was telling you about, Québec Solidaire. That's their young leader, Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois. We like to have composite name in Quebec, Jean-François Godbout, but people that were born after me in the 90s they also hyphenated in a last name, so you get something like Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon or Jean-François Saint-Pierre Plamondon. So very, very long name, right? But jokes aside, so Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon is the leader, youngish leader of the Parti québécois. So these are the polls. Since the election, each line represents a poll. The points are the popularity of the party since October 18, leading up to the election. Last poll I took, I think, was in February. You can see the CAQ is polling very well, around 40%. During the pandemic, there was sort of a rally around the flag effect that got them close to 60% in some polls in popularity. They're declining a bit, but they're still at 40%. And you see the new kid on the block, the black line here is the Conservative Party that's polling now at, because, we'll talk about this, but it's mainly because of the pandemic, the opposition towards the public health measure. But most parties, there's been a decline. Most parties stay relatively stable. So I wanna take a moment here to tell you sort of what people like me who study party systems and politics in Quebec, what we know about what's going on, what can explain this strange party system, and sort of what we don't know and what I can explain to you today. The time you're giving me, the payoff is you'll have a better understanding of what's going on, okay? So that's my deal with you today. So we know that, big surprise, the old parties that were there, at the beginning of the 2000s, which is the Parti québécois and the Parti libéral du Québec, we know that they're less popular today at the expense of newer party, one of which being the Coalition Avenir Québec, the party that's currently in power, the incumbent, and also Québec Solidaire, the Labour Party, the Orange Party. We also know that this increase in popularity of the new party is linked to a decline in the support for sovereignty, right? So Quebec had 2 referendums to separate from Canada to become an independent country in 1980 and 1995. And during that period, the 2 main parties polarizing was the Parti québécois in favor of independence and the Parti libéral du Québec, which was a federalist party in favor of staying within Canada. And this sort of debate, which kind of consumed my youth, really was the main issue. Everyone was talking about this all the time. Now it's not so important for the younger generation in Quebec. They care about different things, right? And they care about different things like the environment, the economic inequalities, but also the management of diversity, immigration, minority group, and this is what I will be talking most about today. So this is associated with the emergence of new issues, new cleavages, new conflict. And so the old parties are not able to kind of deal with that really well, so the new parties are gaining ground because of that. So in order to make sense of that, I borrow from the American political science literature, right? I was trained in the US. That's where I got my PhD. So I came back to Canada. I used some of the theories I learned in the US, try to understand what's going on in my own country, right? So some political scientists in the US came up with a concept called a political realignment. I'll be talking a bit more about what it is, a realignment. So are we in this period right now? Is this a realignment in Quebec? Looks like it. And is this the end of the 2 old parties? That's another issue. We'll be talking a bit more about this in a moment. So what is exactly a political realignment? So as I mentioned before, to make sense of what's going on in Quebec, I borrow from the great political scientists in the US, E.E. Scheider, V.O. Key Jr., Walter Dean Berman, political scientists from the 70s and the 60s. What they call a realignment is really when there is an emergence of a new political cleavage in the party system that's going to change the way parties oppose each other. That's sort of a realignment, right? So there's 2 conditions. You need to have the modification in the composition of the coalition that supports the different parties, and you need to have a change in the nature of the conflict that oppose these parties. And those 2 factors together is what we call a party system, okay? Numbers of parties, issues that divide them. So the conflicts, they're usually about really, really important social issues, right? They're linked to language, religion, labor versus owners, deep stuff, as we say, right, in sociology, right? So the theory of realignment tells us that a new party will emerge only if the old parties are incapable of addressing sort of the concerns that are emerging with these new issues, right? So I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but go back to 1860, right? You have the Republican Party, it's a new party, talks about the issue of slavery, right? The other parties were talking about the issues, the Democrat and the Whigs, right? But the Republicans wanted to do something about it, and they eventually replaced the Whigs, right? So that's sort of the same idea, if you will, all right? I'm simplifying things. I hope there's no specialists of 1860 politics. It's from my grad school day. I try to remember American politics. But anyway, so keep that in mind. So in the American context, I mentioned there's been a few realignment that have occurred over the years. In 1820s with the emergence of Jacksonian democracy and the Whig Party. In 1860 with the Republicans emerging, and the New Deal coalition in the 1930s being another example. So the most recent realignment that we have is sort of the Southern realignment in the 1960s the realignment of Southern Democrats towards the Republican Party during the 1960s because of the civil rights issue, right? So the Southern state at the time, during Jim Crow, right, most of the voters were white and they were supporting the Democratic Party. But once President Johnson introduced civil rights bill, what happened was the Southern Democrats, the establishment got angry. They didn't want to support the Democratic Party anymore. First, they voted for a Republican. If you look at the electoral map of the 1964 election, presidential election, the Southern state are almost, if I recall, the only one voting for Barry Goldwater was an extreme Republican, even at the time, right? So in 1968, the Southern Democrats, Southern state, voted for the American Independent Party, which was a state-right, anti-civil rights party, right? And once Nixon was elected, he kind of came up with a Southern strategy, which allowed him to bring the Southern Democrats within the Republicans' fold. And this realignment process, now when you talk about the Southern of the United States, you don't think Democrats, right? You think Republicans. But this was not complete until the 1990s, so it took a while. So that's the realignment that I'm talking here. So one other aspect that we want to really keep in mind here is that a realignment in the U.S. always comes back to two parties opposing each other. There's sort of this two-party equilibrium. But as I just told you, it's not the case in Quebec. So what's going on in Quebec, right? So you'll be relieved, I'm sure, to know that historically there's always been more or less two parties opposing each other in Quebec. This last period is really unusual, but if you go back in time, might not have been the same two parties, but there were usually two main parties in Parliament opposing each other. But we also had several realignment, like in the US, where perhaps for a little bit there was three-party, and then it came back to the two-party equilibrium. First, you had like the blur, the conservative against the Reds, the reformists, the liberals, around the Confederation time in 1867. Then, after a lot of things happened, you had the new Conservative Party, Union Nationale, that I know you've heard about, Maurice Duplessis, that's his party, the students in the Canadian politics class. They emerged following a realignment in the 1930s as well. And finally, in the 1970s, you had a realignment with the emergence of the Parti Québécois, a new party that replaced more or less the Union Nationale, with the opposition, as I mentioned earlier, between sovereigntists and federalists. So like in the US, these realignment began with sort of like the American Independence Party. There's a weird party coming up, and then things are unstable for a bit, but after a while, there's a two-party equilibrium. It comes back to that. And I gave example, I can go into details in the Q&A here of the different party names that popped up and disappear over time. Right, so the logic is disappearing now in Quebec. So I'm looking at party families, okay, because the parties change name a lot. I just grouped them by four families. The only parties that, since 1867, that's the percentage of seats in Parliament. Since 1867, the only party that's always been around is the Liberal Party of Quebec, the red line. So the higher the line, the more likely they are to form the government because they control more than 50%. Whenever you go over that line, 50%, you have a majority government. Does that make sense? All right. So the Conservatives started strong, disappeared, and went up with Duplessis, down again, up again with the CAQ. Nationalists, there were some nationalists in the 19th century. But it's really with the PQ in the 60s that climb up, and now you see the decline in representation. And now you have that Labour Party. There were Labour MPs elected, MNAs, in the 19th century in Montreal, but like one or two. It's really like the most recent election you see that new party. So really, like, look at all these lines. That's what I call a messy party system, if you will. Okay. So in political scientists who study party system have sort of noted that there exists a relationship between the numbers of parties and the number of conflicts of important divisions within a society. There is like a mathematical logic to this. According to two famous political scientists, Seymour Lipsey, who is Canadian, and Stan Rockin, he's European, I'm not sure where he's from. Forgot, maybe, Chris, do you remember? Norway, right. I knew that. Just wanted to make sure if you did. They realized, they kind of came up with the idea through their, looking at different countries, that the more cleavages are separating a society, important cleavages, the more party you will have. Therefore, the numbers of parties in a society, it can tell us something about the nature of the political conflict in a party system. So if we had a purely institutional explanation of the party system in Quebec, we would be like, well, the vote system since 1867, the plurality voting system has always been the same. Yet, certain moments there's two parties, other moments there's three, other moments there's four. It can't be just an institutional explanation. Something else is going on. So we have to move to a sociological explanation. And so for two other political scientists, I'm going to stop the name dropping in a bit, but for Tagapera and Laxo Tagapera and Groffman, they came up with this formula that says really that the number of parties in a society, in a party system, equals the number of cleavages, important cleavages, plus one. Okay? So if we do a little bit of algebra, right, we can shift things around. So we know there's two parties in the US. Minus one gives us one cleavage. And right, what we know about the US right now, it's super polarized on the right and the left between liberals and conservative, Republicans and Democrat. Everything is all mixed together, economic, cultural issue. It seems to always find a way to separate Republicans and Democrat. That's one line of conflict, right? When in Quebec, you have four parties minus one, so if we follow that logic, there should be three main political cleavages. So today I'm going to try to convince you, right, that these three, because right now this is an assumption, right? I'm making this claim. There are three important cleavages. Here they are. I'm going to try to convince you that they're important. But the first one, I think you don't need a lot of convincing. The issue of sovereignty has been so important in the last 50 years, still a bit important. That's an issue. Second one, taxation, left versus right, right? No one likes to, some people don't like to pay taxes. Other people like to redistribute the rich from the wealthy to lower socioeconomic individuals in society through taxation, redistribution. That's sort of a big issue that's also big in the US. At least it was until the mid-2000s. So my assumption is that these three cleavages are the main dimensions of conflict in Quebec. I'm sorry. So let's begin. I'm just going to go over these cleavages for a minute, then we're going to talk about my study. But The opposition between sovereigntists and federalists, as I mentioned before, dates back from the 1960s and 70s, can be linked back to the civic state nationalism of the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s. So at first, the Liberal Party was the nationalist party using the states to kind of bring French Canadian, like Québécois, French people who spoke French in Quebec, Francophone, raise their economic level by using the instrument of the state, that state nationalism, and later that became sovereigntist nationalism, but it's not conservative clerical nationalist based on religion or language. I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment. It's mostly associated, like I said, with the Parti libéral du Québec and the Parti québécois in the 1980s and 1995 referendums. And there's been a decline. So that's percentage from 20% to 70% in favor of sovereignty only among francophones in Quebec. Average of surveys between 1985 and 2000, I think it stops in 2013 or something. So you could see that during the 1990s, it was really high, close to 60%. But that is excluding allophones and English-speaking Québécois. So if you put them in the plot, it goes to 50-50 more or less. But it's been declining, and it's still declining. I just didn't update that figure. So, last thing. So the position of the parties doesn't take rocket science. You look at the party platforms, you know PQ promotes sovereignty, Québec Solidaire promotes sovereignty, so the Labour Party does. Parti libéral du Québec and the CAQ are straight federalist party. They don't want secession. The second issue has to do with economic redistribution. Threw away my notes here, sorry. And this issue really is the classical opposition between the left and the right, if you will, liberals and conservatives, just like in the US. Think about this, if you will, to help you. It's linked about redistribution, taxation, but also more and more about the environment, right? So the right is more in favor of businesses, the left is more in favor of state intervention to try to promote, fight against global warming and take more drastic actions to slow down growth and whatnot. So the PQ, although it was originally a very left-wing social democratic party, absolute power corrupts absolutely. They were in governments during the 80s and 90s, and they had to make some tough decisions. They moved to the center, even to the right in 1998, and it really exasperated a lot of those left-wing members of the party who left in 2006 to form their own party, which is Québec Solidaire, which I've been talking about in a moment. So PQ and QS are on the left. The Parti libéral du Québec and the CAQ are more on the right, okay? So that's the position of the party. Finally, the new issue that I'm going to talk mostly about today is the positions of the party on this what I call the diversity cleavage, which is an opposition between pluralism and integration in the management of immigrants, but also of cultural and religious diversity in Quebec. Listen, there's been Jewish people in Quebec since almost since the conquest. I believe, I'm sure in 1800 there were Jewish people in Montreal, positive of that. So you can't tell someone who's descendant from this population, look, you're not a Quebecer. They've been around for 200 years, right? 250 years. So that's why I make the difference. There's immigration, but there also are people that have been around for a long time, third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation immigrants that are kind of, some people in Quebec would like them to integrate more to the Francophone majority. On the other hand, some politicians, some political parties, they're more in favor of pluralism. If you want to link that, if you are familiar with the concept of multiculturalism, that would be a position they defend. Or in Quebec, it's called interculturalism, which is our own version of multiculturalism within a province, right? So this debate, I argue, it can be linked back to a more traditional view of nationalism. that existed prior to the Quiet Revolution, centered around the protection of the language, the French-Canadian culture, meaning the descendants of French colonial settlers, if you will. So the PQ and the CAQ have been both parties that have promoted the integration view of Quebec through the value charter of the Parti québécois in the 2000. It was never adopted, but it was proposed in 2014. And then what we know as Bill 21, if you're familiar with this, and not respecting the laicity of the state. So just to give you an idea, here is what the value charter wanted to impose on public servant, teachers, university professor, police officers, prison guards, doctors, and maybe I'm hires up in public administration. You would not have been allowed to wear conspicuous religious symbols, the kippah, the niqab, the hijab. These would have been, you could wear them in private on the street, right? It's not like in certain European countries where they're forbidden even in public, but you couldn't have worn them in your job, right? So I have a colleague who's Jewish, he would have had to not wear his kippah or lose his job as a university professor, right? So you can understand, you can imagine, this is a very, very controversial conflict here, and we need to talk about it to understand what's going on in the party system. So, as I mentioned, the CAQ and the PQ are more on the integration side. The Parti libéral du Québec and Québec solidaire are more on the pluralist side of this debate. Okay? Now, wait, there's more, right? What about this fifth party that I've been talking about? Well, all the parties, you know that Quebec had some of the strict, maybe you do know because you cross the border sometimes to visit friends or go out in Montreal, but we had some of the strictest pandemic health measure in North America. It was, everything was shut down, curfew, public mask, vaccine passport, you name it, we had it, right? And for a long time. And all the parties in Parliament, the four parties that were elected in 2019 in Parliament, they all were in favor of these public measures to some degree. So the new kids on the block, the Parti conservateur, saw an opening there. He says, all the parties are on the same side of the cleavage. There's at least 20% of French-Canadian, of Québécois, that are, kind of not happy about these measures. So by taking a position against these measures, the only party that did, they were able to go up the polls. So really, they're in favor of individual liberty versus public health measure. So, but this is a temporary cleavage in my view, because those measures are almost gone. You can go to Montreal on April 1st, you'll see there's no more tests across the border and everything is open in Montreal. So that's why it's temporary, but it confirms the theory, right? An important cleavage. Parties that are not meeting, they're not in there to sort of address the issues. A new party is going to come along, channel that sort of the dissension, that disgruntlement, and go up in the poll and perhaps replace another party. So right now, I'm going to talk to you a bit about my empirical work. So in order to sort of verify the positions of the parties on these cleavages, these three cleavages, and to understand how they relate to the vote, right, to understand what's going to happen in 2022, right, in this election, I'm going to rely on public opinion survey data from 3 electoral surveys conducted during the 2014, 2018, and 2012 election, right? I'm going to identify, from the surveys, I'm going to identify respondents who voted for either one of the 4 parties that were in place at the time, right? And then I'm going to create some scales by combining some questions in the surveys. These scales are going to tap into these cleavages I just explained. And I'm going to try to see where are the voters, where are they straight on these issues? And can I learn something from that, right? So those scales are going to be about sovereignty, about the economy, about diversity. And then I'm going to compare the average, the mean of the position of the voters over time in those 3 elections. And you'll see it. We're going to learn some interesting stuff. But really, it's that simple, right? So how do these scales work? Oh, yeah, sorry. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about the voting analysis, but I'm happy to go over it in the Q&A if you're interested, because it's going to take a chunk of time just to explain how I do that, but I do look at how it relates to the vote. Right now, we're just comparing party positions, so the questions I'm using on the scales are a combination of question on sovereignty, attachment to Canada, for instance, the left and right scale, or a question, is there enough immigrants? Should we lower or increase, stay the same number of immigrants in Quebec? Combined with immigrants, should they keep their own culture, pluralism, or should they integrate? I combine these questions to create a sort of a diversity scale. It's all on a 0-1 scale, right? So, and then I take the average. So I represent here I begin by the left and right positions of the parties, okay? So this is 2012, 14, 18, right? This is my 0-1 scale, 1 being right, 0 being left, right? And these are the parties. Red is Liberal, CAQ, PQ, QS, all right? So comparing over time, parties on the right, parties on the left, thank you very much. Nothing really mind-boggling here. Well, if you look at sovereignty, I told you this was really like people were almost killing each other. They were blowing up in the 70s. Bombs were exploding. This is a very, very polarizing issue. PLQ almost 0 on that scale. And the Parti Québécois, 1 being like I'm 100% sovereigntist all the time. The PQ has that pole. But we know that CAQ is federalist, and we know that QS is sovereigntist, and it's sort of pan out. Where it gets a little more interesting is when we look at this integration versus pluralism. So 1 is integration, 0 is pluralism. So here you see not much different in 2012. Gets a little more polarized with the value charter I talked about for the PQ in 2014. But look now in 2018, it's really getting to become a more and more important issue. So if you go back and look at the figures, you can see the divergence theory, right? The two-party equilibrium. You can see it exists, right? There's 2 parties on the left, 2 parties on the right for left and right. And then there's 2 parties on the left, 2 parties on the right, the same 2 parties, the same 2 dyads when it comes to sovereignty. So they could eventually get along if they really wanted to, but what's going on with the diversity issue is that you have one party on the right on a bunch of issues, a federalist party with a sovereigntist party, if you will, and a federalist party with a sovereigntist party, complete opposite here. They share a similar position in favor of pluralism. Let's take 2018, that really works better here. So you see that the dyads, that they're not the same, and that's where the brick hits the wall. I'm using a polite term, but you can make you can understand what's going on here. So just to restate, there's clearly those classical dyads of the PLQ with the CAQ against the PQ and QS. So the Liberal Party with the party currently in power on the right, the Federalist Party versus the Parti Québécois and Québec Solidaire, the party on the left, leftist party, sovereigntist party. They should find common ground, a lot of common ground. But on this new issue, they don't, because the dyads are reversed, right? And the last time that this happened in the party system, where the current parties, and there were like 4 parties in Quebec for a short period of time, was when the new issue of sovereignty came about in the 1970s, and the PQ and the PLQ were together when it came to maître chez nous, nationalism, but when it came to sovereignty, the PLQ was on the opposite end of the PQ. They were closer to the Union Nationale. But what happened is Union Nationale disappeared, and another party that was a bizarre agrarian party called Crédit Social, they were also on the right, and they were federalists, and they disappeared. So are we sort of heading in that direction, meaning that some parties, who's going to be left, standing at the end? Right. So the question becomes now, is identity becoming sort of the dominant cleavage in Quebec? And in my view, it is, right? Because as others have said before me, Lipset and Rockham being the most famous political scientists who've outlined this thesis, is that whenever you look at a party system today, right, you cannot make abstractions of what went on 100, 200 years before when the party system was first organized and developed. And sometimes the cleavages that mattered 200 years ago still matter today. And I just give you the example in the US about civil rights. You can go back to the Secession War and even before, right? This issue still matters today in explaining American politics, right? So for Quebec, for French Canadians, the descendants of white settlers, French colonial settlers, their most important cleavages has always been about opposing the center. What do I mean by that? It's about the issue of survival, about opposing first the British Empire, later the federal government who replaced the British Empire in order to protect the French language, the Catholic faith, and French colonial institutions, right? So this center-periphery cleavage that is identified by Lipset-Rockham, they talk about center-periphery, church versus state as important cleavages, rural versus urban, owner versus label. In Quebec, what matters is la survivance, right? And la survivance, I think they saw that in your class, Matthew, or no?
Well, it's in the chapter, but in the chapter on Quebec, it's like, they do mention that that's an entire section.
Okay, well, I'm glad they do. So la survivance is also valid for Franco-Americans, French Canadian that immigrated to New England or elsewhere in the U.S. And for a long time, they kept sending their children to Catholic schools, French Catholic school for a period of time, then Catholic school, in order to protect this heritage, this French heritage, right? So for two famous political scientists, one political philosopher and one sociologist, I steal them, I bring them to our camp, I say they're political scientists, but really they're. One is a philosopher, Charles Taylor, one of the most famous philosophers in the world, who's from Montreal, and Gérard Bouchard, a sociologist, also very famous. They wrote a report in 2000s about this conflict over integration, right, related to reasonable accommodation, right? But for them, and I quote them here, I translated it, there's an invariant in the history of francophones of Quebec that can be activated or dormant at certain times in our history, but it will remain without a doubt at the heart of Quebec's future. That is minority insecurity, right? It's been an issue since 1763. The minute they sign it, the French king signed the Treaty of Paris, what's going to happen to the French people in North America? Most of them are on the Quebec territory. That's been an issue since then. So why is it relevant again? I argue that la survivance was relevant at one point in history. It wasn't at another point, but it's coming back. Okay, it's making a comeback. This is the birth rate in Quebec from 1900 to 2020. Okay, that's the baby boom, right? That's my grandparents. I calculated this for fun. I have 4 grandparents. Right? Between them, they have 40 brothers and sisters, right? So, they're huge families. That was the norm back then. This is one of the highest level of births in the world at the time, right? Today, it's comparable to old European democracies like Germany and France. Nothing against them, just that's the level of birth in the province. It's not about francophone or anglophone, just not number of births. That's the proportion of Quebec within Canada as a percentage of the overall population. That's 30% in 1900, a little less than 1/3. Now it's close to 20%. It's 22%. So Quebec is losing a share of the Canadian population. That's the number of immigrants in Quebec since the 1915s. And it's been increasing at a very high rate since the mid-90s, right? And that's the percentage of non-French speakers in Quebec as a proportion to the population. In 1900, you had immigrants. I mentioned immigrants from the Jewish communities. There were Italians, immigrants, but most of the immigrants was a second wave of settlers, white settlers from the British Isles, right? So those 20% are English speaking for the most part in 1900. Nowadays, not so much. It's mostly allophones, so immigrants from Asia, Latin America, other parts of the world, Africa, but they represent also an increasing part. They don't speak French at home, a non-native speaker, if you will. They represent a bigger part of the population of Quebec. So these trends represent for a significant proportion of the population. I'm not saying everyone in Quebec, but for a lot of people in Quebec, these represent a threat to the survival of their culture, their language, right? So it threatens the survival of the French majority in Quebec, but it also threatens the French minority in Canada, if you will, right? Because that's you have to remember, Quebec is a majority Francophone population on its territory, but within North America, within Canada, it's a minority. So what I will argue, and I'm going to end soon, is that we can use social psychology. We can move away a bit from political science, go to social psychology, try to understand what's going on. When a population feels threatened, right? The threat of assimilation, according to social psychologists, will increase feelings of collective anxiety and the desire to protect the language and culture. Right? Look at me, I speak relatively well English. I'm not threatened by the disappearance of the French language as much as someone like me, my same age, who lived elsewhere in Quebec, who doesn't know English very well, who works 100% in French, sees movie dubbed in French and everything. That's fine, that's okay, right? But they're thinking about their kids, their grandkids, and they're saying, perhaps, you're going to need to speak English in a short while to have a job anywhere in Quebec. And that, what is, I'm okay, but what about my grandchildren? What about my kids? And I'm not saying that everyone's thinking like that, but it's a distinct possibility for a lot of people, because not a lot of people are fully bilingual like I am in Quebec right now. So historically, we know that this sentiment, this feeling of assimilation can lead to a defensive reaction. And this defensive reaction will be greater in periods of relative deprivation. And in Quebec, scholars have shown that whenever French speakers have experienced high level of existential threat, these levels of deprivation have gone up. These feelings of anxiety have gone up. Even if we ask about people today about their view of what happened 200 years ago, they'll be more anxious when they talk about the conquest. They'll be more proud when they talk about the Patriot Rebellion of 1837. They'll be a little more, conservative when we talk about what happened afterwards. But really, so the conquest raised the level of anxiety. The Patriot War reduced it. As a backlash, because the Patriot War was lost, there was a rise in conservatism, in clerical nationalism, protection of the church, the Catholic faith, the language, which led to the Great Darkness of Maurice Duplessis, which, because of the baby boom, created the Quiet Revolution and the referendums, which was a period that anything can happen, maître chez nous. But the failures of the referendum led to this new wave of anxiety with these demographic change that are now raising this level of relative deprivation. So I argue that this minority insecurity is higher today because of the demographic trends I just explained to you a moment ago. So minority insecurity, I'm not pulling this out of my hat, right? It comes from, like I said, like a long series of studies. Tachefel being the most famous one who studied this sort of in-group, out-group favoritism. So the experiment, to give you an example, is you could split a group however you want it, assign a color, red versus blue, and next thing you know, if you ask people who's your favorite, they'll automatically, as human nature, converge toward their group, right? They'll prefer, if you're with the red group, you'll be in favor of the red group, you'll want to punish that's in our human sort of DNA as social animal. We like to organize in groups, out group, and favor the members of our own group, right? So Ashley Jardina has shown that in the US, a similar sort of conservative backlash is being observed among the white population because, according to her, the fact that the US will become a minority-majority nation by 2050, this raises the level of anxiety for certain voters who identify as white. It doesn't mean they have racial prejudice, but they will favor policies that protect the majority status of what they perceive as their group, right? So I won't go into detail here, but really it's a sort of similar trend here, and it's relevant in Quebec because the majority in Quebec right now, since the 70s with Bill 101, now with Bill 21, has been implementing conservative policies to protect the French language, the French culture, by overstepping the rights of the minority, right? But if you kind of try to figure out in this context where the majority feels threatened, the language, it makes a little more sense, okay? So the main idea here is that the CAQ, right, the party currently in power, the Coalition Avenir Québec, is using this issue of integration as a wedge issue, all right? This feeling of insecurity, they're using it in politics to make, to get votes, right? And they promote aggressively the protection of the French language and culture. And for François Legault, like he said that, the Prime Minister himself, that's what he said, I'm translating here. He said, to me, being a nationalist is first and foremost based on three pillars: the French language, the culture, and the secularism of the state. So we want to get religion out of the states. But it's not as easy as getting all the religion out. It's really what it means. It's the majority prefer laicity, which is its own form of religion, if you will. The minority with their kippah and niqab or hijab, we don't like that here in Quebec. That's what he's saying here, right? So in the 19th century, the clerico-nationalists, they were saying the same thing. They were saying, the conservatives were saying, we need to protect our institutions from French colonial institution, our languages, our laws, right? And language being the guardian of the faith, the Catholic faith, right? So now the new faith is not the Catholic religion, it's secularism, it's laicity. So what are the implications of all of this, right? So really what we saw is diversity is becoming a central issue in Quebec politics. It's giving an advantage to the Coalition Avenir Québec. It's really, in my view, the beginning of a realignment because it's changed the partisan coalition that I've described, the dyads. Remember the graphs with the squares, right? So it's becoming dominant because it's going back to la survivance, one of the core founding issues, conflict of Quebec politics since the end of the French colonial institution. And the position of the CAQ on this issue has a lot of credibility among a French majority. It's giving them an advantage. It's going to give them an advantage for a lot of elections to come. So to conclude, if you look at projection of seats in the upcoming 2022 October elections, right? So they have a seat projection based on polls, just like you have in the US with presidential elections, right? So they're predicting with 40% of the polls that the CAQ will win 100 out of the 125 seats, that the Liberals would get 20 seats, that Québec Solidaire would get 10 seats, the PQ will disappear, maybe the Conservative Party will win a seat. So that means, according to our formula, if there's only 3 parties left, you get 2 cleavages. So which cleavage will disappear, which party? I'm always wrong with predictions. I predicted that Trump would not win in 2016. I was wrong. I predicted that Brexit wouldn't happen. It happened. So don't believe me. Maybe I'm wrong, completely wrong here. But based on what other people are saying, this is my prediction. Parti Québécois is going to disappear, and we won't see this issue of nationalist independence take over. It's really going to be more an issue about conservative nationalists to protect the French language and culture. I want to thank you for your attention. I'm sorry if I went over time. You can look me up on the QR code or follow me on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Questions or inquiries, please?
Can I tell my students to go to Moodle and do your attendance?
Thank you, Matthew. Questions or inquiries for Jean-François, based on his remarks and his predictive ability for October? Anybody want to throw anything his way? For you, Matthew, please.
First off, please say that the Canadian will not win the Stanley Cup ever again in my lifetime. So I have like 10 million questions for you, but I'll ask you at the office, like Super Mario, Pelado, the Equality Party, which
Right, it's true.
But I'm interested in what you said about assimilation, because for people who don't want to be assimilated, they're certainly willing to assimilate others, right? So they don't want to be assimilated into Canada, but they want newcomers to be assimilated there. One thing that I go over in my class is the confessional school system in the BNA Act, right? So you've got, which I tell them is basically the Catholic and the not Catholic system, right? Which is now a linguistically based. But wasn't one of the purposes of that to keep them apart so that the French boys and girls would marry other Catholics instead of, you know, you think of something like Maria Chapdelaine, where they go away and then they come back with an English-speaking Protestant wife and a bunch of Protestant kids.
No, it's an excellent point you're making. The French Catholic school system was during the clerico-nationalist era leading up to the 1960s, the creation of the Ministère de l'Éducation. They were not in favor of even having Irish Catholics inside the French school because language was guardian of the faith, right? You speak French, you're more likely to keep your faith. And the system was imported in little Canadas in the Northeast and Maine and Massachusetts and other parts where there was a strong population of French Canadian immigrants. They had their own school system. But to get back to your original point, I guess you have to always keep in mind the paradox, right? So the paradox is it would be a lot easier if everyone spoke English in Canada for everyone, right? But you have a population that is a majoritarian on a territory that speaks a different language so that they can impose its majoritarian will on a minority, which happens to be a majority elsewhere, right? The English speaker. And this presentation, as I haven't said anything about First Nation, I talked about white colonial settlers from France and later from the British Isles. But for the First Nation, they don't have the luxury of being, except in the Great Northern, concentrated in territories to get their own government and their own representation, like the French Canadian could and have done. So that's why a lot of French Canadians think, Québécois francophones, thinking that Canada is a great country and they don't want to separate it. It's just for for a percentage of the population that is close to about half of the francophones, a little over half, that they're pushing for more stringent policies to protect the language and culture. But I'm certainly not part of this group. But like I said, I'm, at a personal level, I'm kind of not the typical francophone in Quebec because I studied in the U.S. and I work in an English environment. So, that's not a good example. But there are other. Maybe you have friends over, you can talk to them if get to visit, try to understand what type of people.
Please.
Do these cleavages or dynamics change when we're talking about federal elections versus provincial elections, and if so, how?
Look, right now, because of those minority governments that I mentioned earlier, that there's one currently, and there's in the federal level, there was one before. The issue of Quebec secularist law, Bill 21, has a tendency to pop up at the federal level. Because politicians at the federal level, they need Quebec to have a majority, not all the time, but it helps a lot. They don't want to, ostracize a lot of the voters I just mentioned, more than half of the Francophone population. So they're not willing, the Liberals parties, the Conservative parties, they're not willing to challenge this Bill 21 that I mentioned earlier. Remember when I showed that picture with the veils being, well, there's a law right in the books right now that's more or less like that. Not as bad, but it's still pretty bad. If you, for instance, if you're a teacher now and you wear a niqab or a kippah, you cannot be hired to teach in a public school. It's in front of the courts, but it's the law, right, in the land right now. And you would think that the real Liberal Party of Canada, Justin Trudeau's father is Pierre Trudeau, the father of the Charter of Right and Freedom that was adopted in 1982, right? The father of multiculturalism. You would think that, if anything, he would be in favor of challenging this law in courts or doing whatever he can to challenge this law. But he hasn't gone on record. He said he doesn't like it, but he hasn't done anything because of the votes that he wants to get in Quebec. But now with the new, I don't want to go into the, I can talk for hours about it. I know you guys will. Thank you.
I find it interesting that the Premier of Quebec, François Godbout, was in the PQ party of, was it René Lévesque? Bernard Landry, yes.
Yeah, so it's good if you ever change your mind about your party affiliation. People have short memories, but René Lévesque used to be a Liberal, became the first,
That's right.
first premier of the Parti Québécois in the province. There's some, Dominique Anglade, the leader of the Liberal Party, was in the Coalition Avenir Québec at the beginning. So, like I said, there are, at home kosher, as we said, there are some Legault is a nationalist, he used to be a sovereigntist, so it's a muddy issue. There's always the threat that he might, what if we push him far enough and we become a sovereigntist again? But I don't see it, especially if you look, if we looked at is the position of the electorate, the people that vote for the parties, and the people that vote for CAQ, they don't want to separate. So they won't go along unless there's a major crisis. They would rather have him, fight the system within Canada, focus on the economy. That's it.
Because if you put the QS, Quebec Studies with the PQ,
That works, except the PQ has its position on diversity is at the complete opposite of the PQ. So they can't even be in the same room. They will go at, there's a generational gap. The young people are, like you guys, pluralist, citizen of the world type of thing, and the old people are like my uncles, right? Parti Québécois, they're very old now, but we remember, and so it doesn't work. That's why they can't. They try to merge, but they fail.
Louise?
Cleavage was very important to the baby boomers and before that. They're all getting older, all kind of dying off. Once the baby boomers are gone, is the surveillance still important to the rest of this new generation or the younger generation? Or is that just going to go away and forget the history?
I think, well, so the typical voter for the CAQ, Coalition de Québec, is someone in my age range, which is a Generation X, with kids that live in the suburb. That's not me, I don't live in the suburb, but, right, so these voters, they care, like people I guess my generation, we still care about this issue, except the surveillance is not about religion so much, more about laïcité for these electors. It's something different, but they do cherish the French language, protecting the French language and the French culture. But it is true that when you get to the generation after us, the Y and Z, it's completely different, and only time will tell. I'm not a sociologist, but we do see most of the votes for Quebec Solidaire. The reason they're there is because the generation Y and Z are supporting them, and they don't care that much about. They want Quebec to be not looking backward but forward.
Questions? Please.
Yeah, I'm older than you.
Right.
Quite a bit. And I watch different things. And I actually, I'm even as old enough that I went to a French-Canadian grade school down near the Albany area.
Oh, wow.
It was true in the city of Cohoes. Two French-Canadian major places, and now they're gone. Now they're gone, and but many of the people who were my age in the 70s and went there. But back then, it was interesting. You could be in a town like Plattsburgh or Cohoes, and you could say, oh, I could go to French school, and you could be English, whatever, international, and you could go to the school, and they had French nuns who put down, and they taught the French language, and so you experienced the French-Canadian culture that you would not have normally had, and it was very interesting. That's just one point. The other thing is that I'm also, I'm a dual citizen, so I've lived in Quebec and here in the States, I voted in both places, and lived in Montreal and in so I found that it's so incredible the change that can occur from one election to the next. Like you had the Liberals in power before the recent one, and they oh, it's great, Liberals, great for the English and great for diversity, this kind of stuff. They had a doctor who was a brain surgeon, and you go, wow, this is for the English, well, not necessarily English, but for people, it was something that was great, it was good for certain elements. Then all of a sudden, this other party came in, which was go, and they're wiped out. And you go, wow, what a change from one election to another. And also, like with the Parti Québécois, in their history, they up high, and all of a sudden, they're thrown into the garbage, almost. And I'm thinking, it's something unique about Quebec that this occurs. Whereas we're talking about the diversity in the United States and the differences, and it's quite something. And the way you explain the numbers and things, I just thought, I've observed that and said, wow, it's quite something how it works in Quebec.
I'm glad that it stimulated your reflection. So what, I guess the takeaway point is the reason why the Liberals were punished at the poll is their position on the diversity issue was not in line with a majority of Francophone. And the CAQ, the Coalition de Québec was able to do is position themselves and strongly in favor of protecting the language and the culture, and that explains why they were able to get 40% of the votes. And they still have 40% of the votes, whereas everyone else is dividing. And that's why it changes so much from one election to the next, because the party system is in flux. But I think now the CAQ is in a good position. And to come back to your earlier point, I'm also here to study Franco-American, and I think one interesting aspect of French-Canadian immigrants to the state in the 19th and early 20th century is like you mentioned, they brought with them some of those institutions, not everywhere, but in some places. And I'm interested in seeing how much of these institutions were able to preserve the language, the culture over time. Even if the language disappears, do you still find differences among French Canadians? So I encourage you to go to my next talk in April and look at these issues. Thank you very much.
I know, David, I'm going to save your question for last. Are there any questions from the students that you may have that came up? Okay, then we'll go to David for the last question, please.
I wonder how much of the attraction to Quebec Solidaire is due to its young leaders.
Well, there's always a percentage of party popularity that can be linked back to the leader. Increasingly, it seems like whenever a party is doing not well, we get rid of the leader, we got a new leader, even if they're in a parliamentary system, they would have, had a decent sized opposition. So that is definitely a fact. But I think Quebec Solidaire is a party, a typical grassroots party, labor party from the ground up. So the young people, they like to kind of participate. The leader explains it to some degree. Thank you very much for coming, guys.
Yes, thank you. Please join me in thanking Jean-François for today's talk.